Good morning. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to a virtual tour of Warriors Gate Moth Museum, and it's my pleasure to accompany the chairman of the Warriors Gate Committee, Lottie Force next to me, and Cedric, who is the custodian, and I'm Tony Munich, and at this present time I am the National Vice Chairman for Natal. And we are present here this morning, and we are seated in the council chamber, which is upstairs at Warriors Gate, and I'm quite sure we will pan around the room in just a few minutes and explain exactly why we're in this locality. But let me take the opportunity of giving you a very quick thumbnail history of Warriors Gate, how it is here and why it is here. So we'll go back to 1936. Prior to 1936, the Moth headquarters building was located in the upstairs of a timber framed building down in the middle of Durban, known as Chateau de Watteau, for want of a better description. But in 1936, at a funeral service attended by the founder of the order, Moth Evenden, Moth O, and his picture's up there, we'll have a look in a moment. Moth O was asked, what can we do for the Moth order? And Moth O responded by saying, how about we build a headquarters building for the memorable Order of Tin Hats? Now, the people he was speaking to were men of quite some influence and substantial assets, and as a direct consequence of that, the Moth order was in receipt of two very kind and very generous donations of money, and the injunction to Moth O was, there you go away and build your headquarters building. And that headquarters building is, of course, what we refer to these days as Warriors Gate. Now, Warriors Gate is in the first instance, is the principal shrine of the Moth order. It's located here in Durban, and in addition to being a functioning free entry museum, which operates entirely on the basis of donations, it's also, in terms of where we are seated this morning, this is the council chamber, and in this particular room is where we conduct the functional management of the Moth order, because the National Executive Administrative Committee meet at least once a month in this building and at this table. And of course we schedule two conferences a year, one in May and one in November, and we're shortly coming up for a national conference again on I think it's the 18th of November, so we're looking forward to that. Now, the origins of Warriors Gate and how come it is a museum. Well, Moth O had in mind, he being of English birth, he had in mind to create a building along the lines of a Norman gatehouse. Now, for those of you who are reasonably familiar with the nature and the structure of castles in England, the entry port to a castle was always protected by a gatehouse, in which the entry to the portal of the castle was administered by a garrison located in the gatehouse. So that was the inspiration for the design of Warriors Gate, and indeed it reflects that concept right from the outset. And when we do the rest of the tour, it'll become very much clearer to you. So in 1936 we had Warriors Gate created, courtesy of some very kind donations, and it started to fill up with artifacts and memorabilia from around the world. We have items of memorabilia here. I think the earliest one is about 65 BC, which is a cuneiform tablet in the museum downstairs. And thereafter it goes through, and we have artifacts tracing the major conflicts from virtually the Middle Ages, where we do have some artifacts which have been donated to us courtesy of Royal Armouries in England, up to and including, of course, the more recent conflicts in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. Now, everything that is present in Warriors Gate has been brought to us and given to us by serving soldiers who have acquired these, we'll call them souvenirs or memorabilia, from their own service in and around the world. So we are privileged to have people's mementos along with the experience that they accumulated in the collection of those mementos. So everything has a story. In the majority of instances, they are of historical significance. When we do a tour downstairs, you'll see our first display case starts off with the early wars, and of course that refers to the early wars in the Southern African context. And then we move around as we will go through on the tour, and we'll go through the periods known as the Boer War, which is actually historically incorrect. It should actually be called the South African War. And we will then deal with the display cases of the First World War, the Second World War, and other conflicts as we go past. It's important to realize that, like with all museums, they are a hard reminder of what transpired, where it transpired, and in many instances there are lessons to be learned. As we go downstairs, we will pass display cases containing, amongst other things, gas masks from the First World War and indeed the Second World War, both military and civilian. And it's to be lamented that the very ugly face of warfare concerning poison gases and what we call biological warfare is still with us today. So the lessons of history are all around us in this museum, and we should profit from the lessons of history in the profound and sincere hope that we can avoid repeating the disasters of past history. Now, we're present, as I say, in this particular chamber, and in just a moment we're going to have a pan around of this particular room, and you'll see affixed to the wall about 560 plaques. Now, these plaques are the, for want of a better word, the badges of shell holes, which is moth units, that have existed in the past and some which still exist. Although we have about 560 on the walls here, we still are searching for possibly somewhere between 80 and 100 which have never ever come our way, and in some instances they seem to have been temporarily lost in the mists of antiquity. But we're working on that because it is a pictorial history as you go around this room, and if you pick on any particular plaque and you look at it and it says, for example, Dusty Bowl shell hole, or Flagstaff shell hole, or Arras, etc., etc., what you're seeing is the reason that that shell hole came into existence. If we have a shell hole, as I'm looking at one across the room here, which is Arras shell hole. Arras, of course, is one of the major battlefields in France and Belgium in the First World War, and there were guys left over from that conflict who, after the formation of the Moth Order in 1927, felt the need to continue the kind of comradeship that they felt as servicemen in that great conflict, and they would have formed a shell hole and used the name, or adopted the name, Arras. So all of these 560 odd plaques that you see around the room contain a story, and they all have a reason behind them, and in so doing they, in their own fashion, they are a microcosm and a history book in their own individual context, and each one of them will tell a story. I look around and I see cannon copy, which is obviously evocative of the South African War, and we have shell holes, for example, Tipperary shell hole, which is again evocative of the song It's a Long Way to Tipperary, and again undoubtedly formed by veterans of that great conflict in the First World War. And so I'm looking forward to a pan around the building and this particular room, and you will see possibly not all of them, but a fair selection of the shell holes which are still with us, and those who aren't with us physically anymore, they remain in good standing and in our memory. So this is a this is what you might say, a privileged environment. This room, being the council chamber of the Moth management structure, the National Executive, is one of those environments which have not quite the same access to members of the public. Normally we would not entertain members of the public in here, but certainly we encourage all members of the Moth Order in good standing to visit the council chamber and to stand in, usually in quite some wonderment and some awe, and examine the history in pictorial fashion as we stand around in this very distinguished environment. Hi, come join me in the main museum. And good morning to you. You're now moving into the main museum of Warriors Gate, and if I can very quickly guide you around, on the left hand side we see a display largely devoted to ancillary weapons, edged weapons, mainly bayonets from around the world and throughout history, and including some rather earlier edged weapons from history dating to prior to 1800. If we turn to this side over here, you'll see a display given over to, again, edged weapons, amongst which are some fairly historically well-known ones, such as the Gurkha kukris, which are these large heavy-bladed knives here, still an issue accoutrement for members of the Gurkha battalion. And we have an example over here of a Japanese katana, which was removed from a Japanese officer in 1945. The rest of the weapons, for example, these swords over here, where you see a heavy blade, that is a genuine combat weapon. If you see a very narrow and delicate blade, those are entirely given over to dress accoutrements and are not intended for fighting. As we move this way, we have a display given over to firearms from yesteryear, and some of them date back in antiquity to the days of flintlocks and then percussion cap of that variety. And then of course we also have some representation from fairly modern days, such as cartridge rifles such as that, and a P14 from World War I, and a German submachine gun. If we look on the top of this display cabinet, you'll see demonstrated some weapons left over from World War I, in particular an anti-tank rifle of quite some size and deportment, and of course a pair of machine guns type MG08 of the pattern used by the German forces in World War I. As we move on this way, we'll see a display case of a typical World War II, but also very largely World War I British serviceman carrying a standard magazine rifle, Lee Enfield Mark I. And here we have a display case given over again also to a variety of weapons, of some of which will be immediately recognized by the people who have a passion for the Wild West. You see varieties such as a lever action rifle popularized by the American Wild West, and of course some fairly modern type things, such as a Martini Henry, which dates from about 1880 onwards, another Martini Henry, and here a celebrated weapon which was taken from the personal bodyguard of the Duke of Aosta and came to us as a souvenir following the Second World War. As we move on this way, again, if I can just open these up, we have a composite display of edged weapons, most of which are given over to infantry accoutrements, such as the heavy bladed weapons such as the sawbacks and the cavalry sabers, etc., etc. Again, comment is where you see a very fine blade such as that, that's a dress weapon not intended for combat. and again a very fine pair of Gurkha kukris. We look down here and we see again a display of various edged weapons and a few souvenirs of fairly well-known popularity these days. The next display case likewise. Is given over to edged weapons of a fairly substantial variety. You see some of the heavy imperial cavalry sabres, which, believe me, if you try and pick up one of those cavalry sabres and hold it out at arm's length, you'll find that you simply won't be able to hand it up. So those were the days when men were men and they knew how to handle the heavyweight stuff. In particular, you'll see such as a Scottish broadsword and a claymore, and so again some cavalry sabres of fairly large import. Again, as I mentioned, these were the days when men were men, because to wield weapons like that you had to be not only physically fit but very able and strong. And behind us we have again a display of a variety of edge weapons, some of which are again very famous. Another example of a Japanese katana, standard issue to the Japanese officer corps, very regrettably used for beheading prisoners of war, not only during combat. And as we look down, we see a display of various dress uniforms from fairly celebrated historical units such as the Scots Guards, King's Horse Artillery, etc., etc. And these, of course, are dress uniforms, not to go to war in, but to participate in functions within military messes. As we pass here, we'll see a variety of weapons which have been donated to us from the Tower of London. You'll see some weapons such as these two here, of the pattern that was used in the defense of the establishment at the Battle of Isantulwana, and you can see the triangular shaped bayonets which were put to very good use. One of these weapons over here is a pedigree which goes back to the Battle of Waterloo, incidentally, and we're grateful for the loan of them from the Tower of London and British Armouries. As we look across here, we'll see a display case given over to personal weapons. When I say personal weapons, we refer of course to pistols and the like, and some of which of course are extremely well known and immediately recognizable, such as a Colt 45, as carried by every cowboy in every Western movie you've ever seen, and also of course some of the more historically appropriate, such as the Webley & Scott 455 caliber pistols, standard issue to British Officer Corps. And at the bottom over here, again some instantly recognizable German weapons such as Luger and Mauser pistols. At the top over there we have some very much older varieties of sidearm, such as a flintlock pistol and a caplock pistol, and even a signaling, a Very pistol which fired an illumination cartridge. And so we can wander through into the main museum, and starting on the left, the display cases in the main museum here are set up on the basis of historical significance, and we'll start with what is referred to as the early wars, 1856 to 1900. And of course the artifacts on display here come from a variety of sources, usually allied to the British Expeditionary Forces against the local populace, such as the Zulu Wars, etc., etc. And we have some artifacts left over from the Battle of Isantulwana, celebrated as the largest and heaviest defeat ever suffered by the British Army in battle. As we come around here, we'll get to the display case given over to the Boer War, which should more correctly be referred to as the South African War. And this one, of course, is the second so-called Boer War, 1899 to 1902. They had a practice session some 10 years before then, but that only lasted a year. Again, artifacts left over from that very local interest conflict lasting 3 years. We go on to the First World War, which was fought between Germany and her allies, and Britain and her allies being the French and obviously the Belgians and subsequently the Americans. And we have various artifacts again, typically recovered from battlefields. Ominously, we see again the protection against chemical and subsequently biological warfare by the issue of gas masks, a form of horrific warfare which is regrettably still with us. And we'll move on to the second display case given over to the First World War, and these are more personal artifacts such as pay books and personal accoutrements such as Bibles and letters, etc., recovered from doubtless the bodies of fallen soldiers, both from Allied as well as enemy forces. Celebrated, of course, in every early World War I film. You'll see the leather helmets called Pickelhaube. In the very early days of World War I, these were commonly worn by German troops, particularly the officer corps. But as the war progressed, more and more was given over to the use of steel helmets, such as that there called the Stahlhelm. And we go on. As we pass, we will see an illustration of trench armor, in this instance as worn by the German troops in World War I, as an attempted protection against not only small arms fire but also shrapnel from air bursting artillery. We then get on to the Second World War, fought by the same teams, Germany and her allies versus Britain, France and her allies. And we see a typical illustration of the variety of steel helmets worn by various elements involved in that conflict, as well as other souvenirs recovered from the battlefield, and in some instances memorabilia relating to fallen soldiers, such as next of kin plaques. A variety of headgear recovered from various battlefields again, and very ominously, a British steel helmet recovered from the Second World War with the strike of a 37mm cannon shell, and it's to be expected that that resulted in a fatal injury to the wearer of the British helmet. As we go on a little further, we get to the Second World War, and this one is devoted to the services. Needless to say, the services involved the Army, the Navy, subsequently the Air Force, and of course the civil services, which we refer to as the elements of the police and similar administrative structures. And again, personal accoutrements such as hats, bits and pieces picked up from the battlefield, items of uniform, and a typical souvenir recovery illustration by people picking up things. Rather famously, you might just be able to see in there the remainder of an incendiary shell, which was responsible for setting so many buildings on fire during air raids, particularly on London in the Second World War. As we go on again, we'll get to Second World War, and this display case is given over to campaigns. For South African forces, of course, we were busy not only in East Africa, but North Africa, as well as Europe and the like. And during the activities engaged in by South African and Allied forces, we had quite a strong influence in, amongst other places, Ethiopia. And while the South African forces were up in Ethiopia, we actually managed to acquire the ceremonial cloak of the Emperor of Ethiopia, one Haile Selassie, otherwise known as the Lion of Judah, and founder of the social organization known as the Rastafarians. We go on a bit further to the Second World War campaigns, and again the distinguished activity of South African soldiers, particularly in Italy, and towards the southern end of Germany. And typically, again, we see the acquisition of souvenirs by way of headgear from the variety of people involved in that, both Allied and opposition. And again, the personal accoutrements such as paybooks and diaries, etc., of the participants. Again, we see, even in the Italian context, we see the reappearance again of respirators and gas masks, reminding us that that particularly evil form of warfare is still with us. In terms of accessories, this display case is usually of particular interest to the ladies who might be interested in taking up a career in nursing, because it's devoted to first aid and frontline attending to battlefield injuries. You'll see, for example, a bone saw and a set of scalpels and a set of trepanning tools for the handling of skull injuries, and of course a very substantial set of forceps given over to the extraction of bullets, which must have been a fairly painful process, because in the First World War we were faced those days with a very limited availability of pain-killing medications of any variety, and even items such as antiseptics were of extremely limited availability. We see over here a set of First World War and in some instances Second World War field dressings. We still have field dressings these days, except they're very much more evolved than these field dressings. And the modern field dressings, of course, contain antibiotics, painkillers and the like, but in principle they are exactly the same. So for the people whose lives were saved by emergency surgery in the First World War, we see the kind of equipment that was used to perform those operations. And my compliments to the medical staff and to the survivors whose injuries were dealt with. We're passing a set of dress uniforms, some of which are of quite some historical importance. The Gordon Highlanders, for example, now part of what they call the Highland Brigade, because they combined all the Black Watch, the Gordons, Argyll and Sutherlands into one unit in the British Army. The Irish Lancers, again, the celebrated British Army unit. Seaforth Highlanders, again, one of the Highland regiments, which has now become part of the Highland Brigade. A Natal Royal Regiment, which dates back to the very early 1900s. And here a particularly interesting one, which is a Royal Flying Corps lieutenant. Of course, the Royal Flying Corps only became the Royal Air Force in 1917. Prior to that, it was accoutrement. The accoutrements of the Royal Flying Corps looked very similar, and in most instances were identical with the ground-based troops, such as the Army. As we pass on the left-hand side, we see the Second World War, and this display case is given over to the guys who were temporarily made prisoners of war of a large variety. In particular, I can draw your attention to a Red Cross aid packet or box, as the case may be. Many millions of these Red Cross parcels were prepared in Britain and the colonies during not only the First World War, but particularly during the Second World War. And it's a matter of record that throughout particularly the Second World War, many millions of these first aid Red Cross parcels were distributed to prisoners of war throughout the European theatre. And the distribution of those was substantially not interfered with, and they reached the prisoners of war in the various camps. The other items over here show typical activities allied to prisoners of war, how to make your own stove to heat up your prisoner of war rations out of virtually scrap material. And here we have a chess set made by a bunch of Italian prisoners of war, the faces of which, incidentally, are modelled on the faces of their jailers in the prisoners of war camp, because the Italians were, of course, noted for their extreme artistry. So much so that there's a set of little shoes which are beautifully executed, and they are made of moistened bread. And they have survived all of those years, right from the Second World War, when they were made by Italian prisoners of war. We go on a bit and we'll have a look at the Second World War and the civil contribution. What's the civil contribution? Well, again, we see that the civilian population were issued with respirators because of the threat of gas warfare. The rest of the display case is given over to items experienced by the civil population, in other words, the non-combating population. This is people who are too old for active service, and of course the ladies and the children. We see illustrations of occupation money, which were issued by invading forces in the countries that they occupied, and we have various bits and pieces left over from the technical aspect. That is a field telephone, which is, should we say, substantially more bulky than today's cell phones by a long chalk, but it certainly did the requirement for battlefield communications. And again, some artifacts left over from the good old days, although still practiced by radio hams, some Morse keys used for Morse code signaling. And again, odd bits and pieces of paperwork, soldiers' service and pay books, and in some instances some pictures of various artifacts such as songbooks, etc., which were issued to people to bolster their spirits during their incarceration. This display case is largely given over to the other less violent side of warfare. We have pictures of Moth Dame Vera Lynn, who actually visited Warriors Gate as a visitor some good few years ago. And we have her signature in the visitor's book. We also were graced with the appearance at Warriors Gate of the royal family during their world tour of 1947. The royal visitors specifically interrupted their tour of Durban and the environs specifically for the purpose of visiting Warriors Gate, and again we have a record in the visitors book of them arriving at Warriors Gate for a visit, which I'm told they thoroughly enjoyed. Here we see the hat of a very celebrated lady, and there's a picture over there, Perla Seedley Gibson, the lady in white. She would go down of her own bat at the harbour entrance, and she had a very good soprano singing voice, and she would sing to the departing troop ships and the arriving troop ships as they came in, as her own personal contribution to the humanity of war. She didn't have a public address system those days, but she did have a megaphone, which she subsequently donated to us. So a very well known and dearly beloved character and personality from the past, particularly during Second World War, and again a British gas mask issued to wardens during the Blitz, and a sobering reminder of the fact that we are still afflicted with chemical and biological weapons. If I turn around, you'll see a variety of display cases. I'll take you back to the first one, which is given over to medals, which will be very familiar to most people who were involved, particularly in the First and Second World Wars. And there's a variety of honours and awards given over to British and Allied troops during those two first great conflicts. And of course, not to dwell on these too long, because there are so many of them. The next display case, for example, is devoted not only to a greater display of First and Second World War medals, but also the medals and awards as issued ever since the change of dispensation in 1984. And again, we have displays of the various forms of uniform and regalia, which are worn by members of the armed forces. And if I can give an oblique shot of the rest, you'll see display cases of a large variety of uniform badges, of rank, etc., etc. and other identification from uniform items. As with all of these things, and if you pan across the top of the display cases, you will see the kind of thing that soldiers manage to put into their kit bags and bring back. That's a Beza tank machine gun, shell casings of a variety of sizes, a British, I think it's a bassoon rather than anything else, not a tuba, and you have shell casings of a variety which have been converted to use as table lamps, etc. And it always puzzles me how a returning serviceman could manage to get a propeller of that size into his kit bag to bring back. So it's a tribute to the diligence of the souvenir hunters. And there's a very quick whistle-stop tour of the interior of the large museum, and I encourage you to pay us a visit because there is really so much here that it would take so long to devote anything less than a full day of your time to visit the museum, and I certainly look forward to seeing you come and join us in due course. Thank you. It's probably pertinent that we revisit the origins of the Moth and how it came about. In 1927, Moth Evenden, then being a cartoonist on the Durban newspaper, the Natal Mercury, drew a cartoon showing a tin hat, a steel helmet, sinking into the sea of forgetfulness in front of the shadowy form of a wounded soldier observing it sink into oblivion. Motho himself was a veteran of the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, and he felt very keenly the loss of comradeship that he personally and many other ex-servicemen felt shared by frontline soldiers. As a consequence of the publication of that cartoon in 1927, the editor of the Natal Mercury supported Moth Evenden to go ahead and form the association which subsequently became known as the Memorable Order of Tin Hats, and it led to the formation on the 10th of May 1927 here in Durban of the Moth, as it is so called. Moth Evenden himself, of course, enjoys the title of Moth O, being Moth Zero, and the very first one, and of course he's followed by an even more well-known character by the name of Moth One, or Moth Number One, which was of course Moth Jannie Smuts. And of course we are again seated here today in the council chamber of Moth Headquarters building at Warriors Gate, and up on the wall is an original copy from the Natal Mercury featuring the cartoon which so ably and aptly led to the formation of the Memorable Order of Tin Hats.
Good morning. My name is Luddy Voss. I'm the chairman of Warriors Gate. As the vice chairman so aptly described the significance of this particular building, room, also was known as the long room, some like to refer it as the sanctuary. For me it is almost a shrine, as he said, a history of Mothdom. Also in this room, which is also of importance, up on the wall there you'll see the names of all the national chairmen, the custodians, the old bulls of the order, of which there are numbers. As was pointed out, we rely solely on donations to run and maintain this place. It is very costly. It requires constant maintenance, as do most museums. The stuff that we house here is very old and needs to be cared for. Not only the maintenance of the buildings, but all of the safety features that are required to maintain not only the integrity of the building, but the safety of the public, the fire extinguishers, the gas. We are very blessed and fortunate to have shellholes that donate regularly to us. large sums of money on an annual basis. We have some that donate on a monthly basis. And people that just come and visit us, we encourage them to make donations. You know, every bit helps, whether it's R1 or R1,000 or 10,000 Rand. We rely heavily on those donations. So from our point of view, this virtual tour and the concept of it, and hopefully the outcome as proposed and discussed, will be of tremendous benefit to Warriors Gate, which is a place that every moth should endeavour to visit at least once in his lifetime. There's never a day that goes by that when I enter here, I have goosebumps. It's a sensation. So yes, please, when you watch this, think of us and dig into your pockets, please.
Good morning all, my name is Cedric Cobb and I am the custodian stroke caretaker of this establishment, Warriors Gate. I've been in this position for nearly 2 years, and as a young moth I've always felt that this is a place of importance for all moths, as it was earlier said. My position here tells the following. I look after the security aspect with regards to the museum. I do the maintenance, and I ensure that everything runs 100% here in order to accommodate the members of the public that come and visit. As far as members of the public are concerned, we cater for people off the street who pop in just to come have a look, cater for schools on an educational type of basis. We have a number of schools that come from far and wide within our province, and I take them through the museum and I explain to them what the situation is all about with regards to the first two, or the two great wars that we had. The other purpose that I'm here for as well is obviously to keep everything that we have here that is of value in tip-top condition, and ensure that it stays like this for years to come. Yeah, that's my position currently as the custodian, and I must say I'm privileged and honoured to actually perform this duty. It's not a difficult position to maintain, but it's an honourable position, and one needs to take it as that and keep it as that.
A lot of people have asked us why we have this tradition of paying observance to the vacant chair, as we affectionately call it. Well, it's really quite simple, because every shalal has a vacant chair, and on that chair are items of remembrance from various wars, battles, regiments, etc. Usually a pair of World War I boots, a great coat, maybe some webbing, but always a tin hat, and preferably one from World War I or World War II. And the reason it's there is that every moth entering a shalal is required to button up his blazer, come to attention in front of the chair, do the moth salute, observe a few seconds of respect and silence, and then dismiss himself from the chair. In that way, we are paying respects to those who cannot be here with us due to maybe answering the sunset call or are ill in frail care. So the vacant chair is a very, very important part of mothdom. The issue of the 3 dice, as they are often referred to, they have TC on them with a emblem of a club from playing cards. They have a MH with a anchor, and they have a crown with SM. In the opening ceremonies of the Moth, of a shalal meeting or a dugout meeting, we always refer to true comradeship, mutual help, and sound memory. TC also sometimes is affectionately known as the club. MH is the mud hook, which was a naval term for an anchor, and SM for a sergeant major, because the crown is the emblem of the sergeant major. The true comradeship these are the three ideals that we should practice, not just at meetings, but every day of our lives as Moths. True comradeship is how we feel about each other, we remember each other, and we do things for each other. Mutual help is what we practice in assisting Moths in need, war veterans, the elderly, the infirm, and is not really restricted to Mothdom. Sound memory is we will always remember those that could not be with us due to circumstances such as being killed in action or even dying of old age or an illness.